Recording in progress. today's Overit webinar on building a versatile brand. So I'm Katie Source. I'm a content strategist and marketing coordinator here at Overit. And I'm joined in the studio today by Devin Dinsmore. He's a senior content strategist and works in content development, brand strategy, social media, marketing, SEO, among many other things. And hi, Devin.
Yes.
And I also want to give a quick shout out to our studio manager, Adam, who is running our stream today. If you hear us talking to Adam, that's who that is. And if you've been watching our webinars for a while and have noticed this production quality start to come up, that is all Adam and the awesome work that he's done in this studio. And if you're thinking about stepping up your webinar game, you can actually reach out to us to learn more about how we can help. So you can email us at info@overit.com, and we'll also have our contact info at the end of the webinar to reach out. And then one last piece of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please just put them in the chat if you're in Zoom. And if you're watching, streaming on social media, just leave a comment and we'll make sure to address it during the course of the webinar, or we'll follow up with you offline. So now I'm gonna throw it over to Devin to get us started.
All right. Hi, everybody. Happy Thursday. So today, what we're going to be talking about is, building a brand kind of in 2022 and how you can create something that is what we're calling versatile, agile, and like highly strategic. Obviously, marketing is a lot more complicated than it was 20 years ago. There's a lot more avenues that you have to kind of understand to get your message across and get your message across effectively. So we just wanted to talk to you all about how do you do that. So I think we can get started. So what makes a good brand, which is a big question. What makes it good? So, it's not always entirely definable what actually determines a good or bad brand, but there are a few key kind of sort of quasi KPIs that we can use to sort of get into a position where we feel like, okay, these are the things we kind of need to make sure we're hitting when we're talking about building a brand, a new brand, or building a brand that's kind of you feel is weak or something like that. So the kind of four things we've identified is memorability, versatility, relevancy to your audience, and authenticity. Today we're going to be mostly focusing on versatility, but we're also going to talk a little bit about memorability, quite a bit about authenticity, and keeping things relevant, because these are all kind of packaged together and they all kind of work together to make something effective. And at least in your eyes, that you're proud of and you feel is good. So the versatility playbook. What is brand versatility, right? So how we kind of define it here is it's the ability for your brand to be communicable across a variety of mediums to a broad range of different audiences without sacrificing the core being of what your brand is all about. So without sacrificing your authenticity. Users, especially the more internet savvy users or customers that you're dealing with, are becoming a lot, their expectations for what your brand is kind of giving to them has gotten, it's grown more and more. There's a lot more avenues in which people are expecting you to be communicating with them. There's a lot more avenues that people are actually utilizing in their daily lives that they are expecting brands to kind of communicate to them through. So in short, that kind of means whether you're using every single avenue available or not, you at the very least need to understand how to communicate or kind of how these different mediums are functioning. So we're talking about online video, whether it's a short video, an advertisement sort of video, or a longer video on something like YouTube, an explainer, a webinar, a training video. Blogs, again, both kind of short and long form blog content, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we carry on. Audio, podcasting, stuff like that, and then traditional avenues, which is your billboards, your television ads, your radio spots, your bus wraps, those kinds of things. So, just to clarify, it doesn't mean your brand is no good if you're not active in every single one of these kind of mediums, right? Because the reality is not every single business is going to necessarily have the financial means to pay for advertising in all these avenues. These things can get really expensive, particularly when you're talking about traditional media, but also, developing video can be expensive. Writing blogs can be time consuming. But what's important is understanding what avenue you think is the most effective towards the audience that you're trying to communicate with. What mediums are going to best serve your demo? What's your competition doing, and what are they not doing? So if your competition's spending a lot of money on something like traditional media, let's say, and you're smaller than your competitor, but you see they're not really that strong on digital, or you don't think they really are doing too much on email, you kind of have some knowledge about that. What are they not doing, and how can you kind of fill that gap? How can you do what they aren't doing? Are there platforms that you aren't utilizing that you should be? Is there a platform that your demographic uses that you're not using? If you're not using it, why? Right? And if you can't use that platform for whatever reason, what are some alternative strategies that you can kind of take to fill that gap? So let's talk about some of the mediums and kind of how you can best communicate them, create them towards your audience. So getting down with traditional.
And I just wanted to point out that this is a callback to our most recent webinar that we had on traditional media planning. So if you missed that one, you can check it out on our YouTube page, Overit Media, or our blog, overit.com/blog. And that goes into more detail on how to leverage traditional media tactics. So back over to Devin.
Yes, and Caitlin is brilliant. So
shout out Caitlin.
Definitely check out that webinar if you haven't already, because she really gets into the nitty gritty of this stuff. But so what is traditional media? I kind of talked about this a little bit, but let's just run through it one more time. It's kind of the old media avenues, right? So you're talking TV spots, billboards, print ads, public transpo ads, radio, printed material like flyers, palm cards, posters, etc. Who is it for? Now, this is a little bit of a tricky question because in this presentation, I'm saying 45 plus. That's not necessarily true, right? I mean, if someone owns a car and is driving, plenty of 20-somethings and 30-somethings own cars and drive every day, they'll see a billboard. If someone is in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond, and they take public transportation, they're going to see the public transportation ads. But when you're talking about like television, especially conventional television, print ads, radio, all those conventional avenues, you're kind of looking at generally a demo that's like in that 45 plus range. So you're kind of taking millennials and Gen Z out of the equation a little bit, but not completely. But it's just something to keep in mind that if you're going that old media route, you are going to have ultimately an older audience that you're trying to speak to. Why is it valuable? Traditional media is extremely valuable because, first of all, you're going to get a ton of eyeballs on your stuff, right? If you have a television spot, a billboard, people are going to be seeing these things consistently. So you have a big platform, but it also means that you have to kind of condense the type of messaging that you're trying to communicate, right? Because you're speaking to way more people, which means you can't be as specific. So you kind of want a simple, generalized message. It can be a really great avenue if you're trying to sort of synthesize your brand into something that like everyone can see and hear and understand, but it can also simplify it a little bit, which has, there's good and bad with that. But all the same, kind of pricey, but that's what a traditional media kind of avenue is when we're talking about traditional. Newer mediums, now these aren't like brand new, but they're kind of, these are digital mediums that have kind of been burgeoning since probably the 2000s, the late 2000s, early 2010s. So one thing we're talking about here is like written blog content. So blog content might feel a little bit, at this point, if you're kind of tapped into things, a little bit outdated, but it still has a lot of value, right? So you can kind of approach blogging from a bunch of different directions. The two ways I kind of approach them is you have your shorter blogs, which they can have value in kind of specific situations, right? So if you're sending out an email or maybe even a text message to a customer, a prospective customer, and you're trying to get some kind of message across to them that you want to communicate, but you don't want them to click on this link and end up reading something for 25 minutes because they'll never do that, right? You can create these kind of short form, quick hit fact sort of blog posts. And these can be valuable because they're not insanely time consuming to produce, and they get the message across really quickly. They turn you into a resource for a customer, a potential customer, and they kind of establish your expertise in something. There's also sort of long form blogging, right, which can be, those are valuable, for someone perhaps randomly searching on Google for just a specific question related to the industry that you're in. The longer form blogs, if they're done right and if they're done in pretty good detail, they tend to do well on a search engine results page, a page 1, a page 2. So someone might search for a question, your company's blog pops up, all of a sudden you're the expert in that field, you have a click back in that blog, you push them to perhaps a sales lead, right? And there's also, utility for a longer blog if you're talking about just something a little bit more complex. Let's say you're trying to get someone to purchase software or something like that, right? That's a fairly complex thing, and if people are searching for that kind of service or that kind of material, there needs to be more detail on what you're talking about because that stuff can be expensive and it's also kind of complicated. Whereas if you're selling a service, like let's say sneakers, maybe your blog is just talking about 5 of the best sneakers in the world or something like that. Something that's a little more condensed, but still valuable to the person you're trying to communicate with. There's not really a right way, but really what you should keep in mind when you're writing a blog is you want to be establishing some kind of authority or thought leadership in your field. And you want to have a little bit of flair with it too, because you want your brand to be communicated across this in some capacity. You want there to be some kind of voice. So, kind of do it how you think is best, but there is one thing I would like to note that I think is important is, don't be afraid to do keyword research. Keyword research can seem really intimidating to people who aren't familiar with SEO. And you don't necessarily have to do it. If the purpose of your blogs is to communicate something to a client, or a customer rather, via email, and you don't really care about Google ranking, you don't necessarily have to do keyword research, but the reality is just like an hour of doing some keyword research can really take your blog to a completely different level, and it can also help you identify the types of questions that customers might be asking. Now, how do you do that? There's a couple different platforms. They're not all necessarily cheap, but what you can also do is you can just kind of research what else is going on Google, right? You can just kind of Google some things you're thinking, and then you can kind of go through and you can look at what different people have done. You can see what kind of questions have been asked. Google has that pretty nifty related feature. So, blogging has a lot of utility, but just maybe try to do a little bit of research if you can, because that can really help you optimize your stuff and really make sure you're getting in front of the people you want to. And then just a quick note on demographics. Blogs are definitely still valuable, as I kind of just recapped, right? But they do trend a little bit older. That doesn't mean that, if you shoot, let's say, an email to a 22-year-old, they're not going to necessarily read a blog inside of that email, but the millennial kind of Gen X boomer, perhaps, age range is more the sort of blog target area, because Gen Z, as we're going to kind of get into, by leagues and bounds, prefers video content.
Yeah, I was just going to point out for the keyword research side too, as someone who is not a technical SEO person, you don't necessarily need, a specific tool. And like Devin said, just kind of Googling, and you can see what kind of questions come up in the search bar. And then you can also scroll down to the bottom and look at the related searches, click on that, kind of keep going through to spark more ideas on what people are searching for.
Yeah, totally. It doesn't have to necessarily be a hard science, because not everyone has the SEO sort of stuff available to them. So, moving on. That's me. Sorry, guys. Video content. So, most people would just rather watch an online video than read a blog, full stop. So despite my advocacy of blogs just a slide ago, the reality is that video is things that people are going to engage with a lot more across pretty much any platform that you're trying to communicate with a customer on. So, in recent years, you have your TikToks, right, which has pretty much exploded in the last 3 to 5 years. YouTube has been huge for probably 10 years at this point. And why video content is becoming more and more important is as you have Gen Z and the younger millennials really aging into the workforce and kind of aging into a position where they are going to start, spending money on things and sort of be considering brands as more than just something that exists, but something they actually are going to purchase from more and more. They're going to start expecting video. So it's not just that it's nice to have, it's that this is how they're largely engaging with the online community, the online world. So if you're not setting yourself up for video, now or pretty soon, you could start missing out on stuff really quickly, especially if you have competitors who are pretty strong in that field. So it's super important, but it's not even just for Gen Z and millennials, even Gen X and even up to boomers. People just generally prefer video, and you have to consider that Generation X is a generation that was raised on television, so they're very, very familiar with that sort of visual, moving image kind of medium that video provides. So just a few quick tips on video. It doesn't have to be really difficult or insanely, high production value sort of situation, right? There's affordable tools. One that we use is Biteable, which you can make really, pretty quickly a video that's talking to your audience, covering a particular topic or thing, and it doesn't cost you a ton of money. There's other options too if you don't really want to go like the kind of slightly produced route. You can jump on and make a video and talk about kind of whatever you think is a topic that's relevant to your audience, or you can find someone who works in your company who could do that. But like getting video out there, period, is really valuable. So yeah, tutorials are great. Short informational videos are great. Interviews with staff, also great, right? Because video can communicate your authority and your essence, or just outright talk about your services. What matters is kind of getting into the space as much as you can, because again, you could get left behind. So whether you're going to drop those in emails, post them on social, edit them down and use them in paid advertising, videos are a really good way to go, right? They're versatile and people prefer them, not only to blogs, but also you're talking about static imagery and even like an HTML5 sort of ad. So videos kind of outperform everything else in terms of engagement on both the paid and organic side of things. So yeah, video is important.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out too, like I know video can be intimidating, but creating a video doesn't necessarily mean that you're creating all new content. Like a lot of your content can be repurposed from blogs or just from website copy. So you're not necessarily making something from scratch, but you're reimagining it in a new way, and that in itself is like making it new. So it definitely doesn't have to be starting from scratch. So I think that's something to remember.
Yeah, and so with all that kind of said, I think we wanted to just roll a couple of videos that we think are interesting. The first one being more of a kind of traditional media piece, one of my favorite pieces of like political advertising in the last 50 years. It's a John F. Kennedy ad from 1960. So Adam, if you want to roll.
Want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new. A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you. It's strictly up to you. But it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy. Do you want a man with spirit who is not afraid to fight?
A man whose record shows that he will fight for what is right.
A loyal man who'd bring the job a fresh new point of view. Well, it's up to you, it's up to you. It's strictly up to you. 'Cause it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
This holds for some tech issues. Okay.
Yeah, so that's obviously a traditional piece, right? It's very old, but I think what that video kind of does, right, is it communicates to their audience, what it's trying to, and understands who it's trying to talk to, and it communicates it to them well, and it uses like kind of an audio jingle to sort of like embed that Kennedy song right into your brain. But it's got a lot of cool imagery, even for how old it is. It's Kennedy's looking young and handsome, and he's got his his young attractive wife, and there's kind of a youthfulness to it that was really like Kennedy understood, or his campaign understood, who they were trying to talk to. And I think that ad is just like a really good example of that. So another one that we have that you've almost certainly seen, so we'll only play maybe the first like a minute or so of it, was Google's Year in 2020 video that I thought was really excellent. So we can roll that now, and we can kind of talk about it.
The most human trait is to want to know why. And in a year that tested everyone around the world, why was searched more than ever.
The spread of the coronavirus has passed a significant milestone.
And while we didn't find all the answers, we kept asking. Some questions inspired joy, others excitement.
Life in the bubble.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I don't know what an improper fraction is.
Keep all of those distractions out of the way.
We found toilet tissue, y'all.
I think we can cut it there.
What are y'all doing?
Yeah, so you get the picture, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen that ad. But it does a really good job of like creating this sense of community, right, that Google tries to cultivate in their brand. But it also, it directly says like, here's the usefulness of this tool. And it's well produced, it's pretty emotional. It's not, necessarily the type of content you're going to be producing if you're a small business, but it's just something to remember. We're going to talk a little bit about authenticity. Google might be a little sketchy on that, but we're going to talk a little bit of that stuff in a short while, and we'll kind of go into like why these like emotional feelings that also kind of intelligently tie back to the brand are important. And so we're just going to do one more quick one, and this one is actually an Overit production for CDTA. This is an excellent video that my coworker Tess Cloud designed and helped create. So let's roll it.
You get yourself to class. You show up for meetings, at home and at work. Your flex is making time for yourself and your community, no matter what. Soon, CDTA will introduce its biggest flex yet, with added mobility options that let you bike, scoot, and share. Wherever you go, however you choose to get there, you can count on CDTA to keep the region moving forward.
Yeah, and that's something that's they're trying to get across a very specific message. It catches your eye. I think it's just a really excellent piece of video content. I think when you see it on whether you see it on your TV screen, or you see it in a pre-roll on YouTube, or it's in an OTT, right? You're really seeing like it pops, right? And it gets across what it's trying to do. It does it really quickly. So that's just like a nice example of, I think, a really good piece of video content. So yeah, I think we can carry on with the rest of the presentation.
Nice little sonic branding at the end too.
Yes, nice, awesome sonic branding. And audio does come into play. I'm not going to touch on that as much in this. We do have some supplemental material we could probably get to anyone who's here right now about audio marketing, but that's a huge piece of it too. Kind of just like with the Kennedy video, we're talking about, oh, he's got this really great jingle, right? That kind of sticks in your head, even if it's a little bit grating at times. That sonic brand at the end of that sticks with you, right? So really an excellent job by the folks here. Adam, who is running this, is also works on our sonic branding, so he does a great job doing that stuff. So authenticity and branding. So what is authenticity and branding? That can be a little bit tricky. I think people, when they talk about authenticity, there might be like undue expectation placed on a small business who's creating a brand that's like they need to be authentic. But it doesn't have to be as necessarily time-consuming, cost-consuming as you might think when you kind of hear, oh, well, your brand needs to be authentic. Really, what it is at the core, you want your brand to really reflect your business, or perhaps it's your client's business, across platforms. So your brand needs a sort of core and a foundation. Brands can live in all kinds of, as we're talking about, mediums, right? You can live in a blog, in a written medium. You can live on a billboard, in an online video. But if there's not like a connective tissue that is like letting an audience know in some capacity, like this is the same company, these are kind of the values or the message or the sort of attitude they're constantly trying to get across, you can kind of create a disconnect. If you're kind of dishonest in the way that you present your brand internally, it can cause, I think some at least confusion, right? If you're seeing marketing materials that don't necessarily reflect how the company goes. And I think externally too, if you're not consistent, at least in some capacity across platforms, you might confuse the user and they might not necessarily know, who, like this is the same company. If your billboard stuff is like completely out of tune, out of step with your, let's say, social media advertising, it can get confusing and it can kind of create an inconsistency. So you want to be versatile, flexible, agile as a brand. You also do want to have a really strong, core, or a really strong sort of like fundamental values that you can kind of push forward to try and kind of keep things not only like consistent, but also authentic, right? You want it to be true to who the company is. And something I kind of say here is people are often skeptical of a company's marketing materials. Prove them wrong, right? Across the platforms, prove them wrong, show them, no, this is really who we are, and we're going to show you over and over again, this is who we are. This is what we believe, we're serious about it, and this is how we kind of show it to you. So the kind of key points with that is, know your company, know your audience, know your brand, know the platforms that you're using, which we'll touch on that in a minute, and be honest to the kind of essence of what your brand is and what the company is when you're building a brand. So what's a good example of authenticity, right? Because that's all a little bit abstract, but who does it well? I'm going to have two examples here. So the first example is Patagonia. You might have heard about some of this stuff. It's a pretty commonly cited authentic brand. But so Patagonia kind of has this commitment to environmentalism and, you know, not wasting things on like clothing. So they're committed to sustainability and the environment. And now we kind of have this list of all these different things, right? So like in 1986, the owner commits 1% of sales, which equals 10% of profits, to activism. The brand switches to organic cotton. They start a venture fund to support eco-friendly startups. You know, they're doing all these different things, right? You can kind of read through these if you want to get each detail. But the point of this is that they're doing all these things that are public facing, that people understand, and that is like reinforcing what they say their brand is really all about, which is like sustainability and kind of protecting the environment, right? So what that does, it allows them to launch a campaign like this, right? So they created this fund, which I'm going to just jump back really quick so we can kind of, it's called the Common Threads Initiative to reduce clothing waste and increase clothing reuse. And they also, in that sort of campaign, that initiative, they also created an eBay marketplace for customers to buy and sell used Patagonia goods. The point being to reduce consumption of new clothing and actually reuse clothing that can still be worn by other people, right? So the point being, reduce clothing waste. And so they run this ad, you know, don't buy this jacket, which is, you know, it's a pretty, you see that and you stop and you go, huh, right? But, you know, the reason they were able to kind of run something like this is because they had done all this work in the past to create, like, really build out their brand and establish that, like, they were being authentic about what they were saying, right? So while this campaign was not necessarily successful, not having people buy this jacket, you know, it ended up increasing their sales by about 30%. The reality is, like, if you look up this campaign on the Google, right, and Google is kind of our digital historian in a lot of ways, right? It got a lot of press, and there wasn't like a ton of blowback to it. People were like, this is great. Patagonia has done all these things over the years. They're consistently getting better as a company. And then they ran this campaign. It was successful, and it got a lot of really good PR for them. So, you know, not to be overly cynical about it, but one nice kind of, you know, advantage of authenticity is it gives you this kind of opportunity to do different things that you do believe in without being perhaps like mocked or chastised on social media, or other platforms where perhaps people might take issue with that. Patagonia didn't face much of the blowback you might see from a different company trying to do this sort of thing. So that's kind of one example. Another example that I don't have a slide for, but that I was thinking about right before this, is a local company. It's Death Wish Coffee. So Death Wish Coffee, I'm not familiar. They might have some sort of more like initiatives regarding different things, but their brand is like, you know, it's kind of edgy, it's kind of cool, it's kind of like chill, but also kind of hardcore. But so they, you know, they're if you don't know Death Wish, they're a Capital Region coffee company that's more or less got national recognition because it's like the strongest coffee in the world is what they kind of claim. And I'm not going to get into too much, but if you're interested in kind of how Death Wish is good at sort of authenticity and versatility, you can see across all these different platforms, right? Podcasting, static images, blogging, video content. They're really consistent with their brand across these different platforms, and they kind of do each thing well. They even post like pretty funny memes
that are on brand, though.
That are on brand, yes. Yeah, so they're really versatile, and they're always being authentic to kind of their core brand kind of feeling and essence. So that's like I think that's a great example, and they're local. So like love to shout out a local company here in Albany, but. Yeah, so that's kind of a little bit, delving a little bit into authenticity, because it can be a little bit complicated. But point being, you don't necessarily have to, you know, Patagonia is a huge company. So they had the opportunity to sort of make these investments. You don't necessarily have to do that to be authentic. You just have to be true consistently across your platforms in some capacity. Quick note on understanding. Oh, sorry, Katie.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, like, when we were running through this yesterday, I asked Devin, like, what are some examples of brands that you think do this well? And we were both sitting there like, that's a great question, because it's hard to do this well. It really is. And there's a lot more examples of brands that don't do it well than brands that do it well. So, you know, just some context there. But I think those are two really good examples.
Yeah, no. So this is just like kind of a little bit of an aside, but I just wanted to make a note about understanding platforms. So I think there's a lot of pressure when you're building a brand, it's like, you need to get on this platform right now. If you're not on this platform, you're crazy, right? Like, whether it's TikTok, perhaps Twitter, although I think, it's also a little bit of Steam, whatever the platform might be. And there will be more in the future, right? Big platforms that come up and start dominating headlines, and you're going to see 100 marketing articles about, you got to get on this platform. I'm not saying you shouldn't get on a platform, but I do think, don't just jump onto a new platform that you're not familiar with without first actually familiarizing yourself with that platform. Because the reality is, you can encounter a user base that has particular expectations. There's this particular kind of dialogue going on, and if you're not careful, you can start making pretty what seem like obvious mistakes. So if we can pull that up one more time. This is a pretty infamous tweet from March of last year. Burger King was running a campaign. Katie, if you want to talk about it a little bit, I think you're familiar.
Yeah, so one of the collateral that they had was a print ad, and so there's a giant headline that said "Women belong in the kitchen," and then underneath it went into the text about basically how they want to have more female chefs in the industry as a whole, and how this is a problem and things they're going to do about it, but using that headline to grab attention. And so that works really well. But then when you move to something like Twitter, where you just have this one tweet, "Women belong in the kitchen," seeing it out of context doesn't necessarily make sense. And they did have tweets underneath explaining it, but you can't guarantee that people are going to read those. And then all it takes is one big influencer retweeting that first tweet, adding their commentary on top. People just see that, and then suddenly it's trending, but not for the reasons you want. So context matters, platforms matter. So yeah, I love this example.
Yeah, totally agree on all those points.
Yeah, another one that I just thought of was, I think it was, what's the lobster restaurant?
Red Lobster?
Red Lobster. And they made a TikTok that it was just a static image that was slowly zooming in, no context, no voiceover, no text, just an image slowly zooming in. And it was weird. It was is this a joke? Is this a meme? Do they just not know what they're doing? So yeah, sometimes it's better to not be on a platform if you don't fully understand how that platform works yet.
Right, or maybe play it safe for a little while before you take a big swing.
Yeah.
Because you just don't want to end up on the wrong side of Twitter's or TikTok's sort of wrath.
And yes, Mark, the recording and slides will be available after this.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks, Katie, for helping me out with that one. So talking a little bit about versatility. Now, this isn't exactly the type of creative that's going to knock your socks off, in my opinion, but I do think it's a really nice example of how a brand can sort of be versatile without kind of losing its way. Right, so in 2019, Colgate ran an ad campaign in the UK, and it was kind of centered around mouth fitness, which wherever you lean on that kind of messaging and that sort of imagery, which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan, but I do think, okay, this is a sort of positive message. It seems to be targeting a sort of maybe millennial into Gen X woman, right? So just based on kind of the assets they provide. So you have that kind of advertising campaign that runs, right? And then in the same year, they kind of did this campaign called the Smile Day Challenge. That was a TikTok campaign using sponsored posts with influencers. And Adam, if you can just run this TikTok quick for us, so you can kind of see what they were doing here. Okay, yeah, so again, out of context, it's a little bit what, right? But that post had 190,000 likes, right? Which is it was fairly successful. Whatever, that's kind of beside the point. These are two different campaigns. They're on two different platforms. They're clearly targeting two different demographics, right? One is targeting, women in the UK, perhaps, in that older millennial Gen X, perhaps age range. And then this other one on TikTok is obviously kind of targeting, a younger audience. TikTok's audience is largely Gen Z and millennials. But they kind of, and the Colgate, one of the Colgate marketing directors, I'm not sure if he's like the grand poobah there, but so he kind of says, when he talks about the brand, he says our brand's core and essence is about optimism. We believe that with optimism, people who convert optimism into action are the ones who change the world for the better. So I don't know if I totally agree with that entire statement, but I do think like both of these campaigns, while being on totally different platforms across different mediums and speaking to two different audiences, there is like a through line between these two things. I think what that shows is they do a really nice job of this sort of positive messaging, positive imagery, kind of silly but positive, dancing, smiling, happy, right? Colgate is a toothpaste company, so they have an interest in that kind of thing. But I think these two examples are just a nice kind of way to show, like, here's how you can kind of be versatile without losing your way in terms of like the core, right, of what your brand is supposed to be and what you believe it to be. So why does this all matter, right? There's a lot of reasons, but just to kind of summarize why it all matters, right? So your brand is ultimately how you're communicating with your customers or any prospective customers. So if you're not engaging your customers or prospective customers, it's going to be really difficult to retain existing customers, but it's going to be even harder to attract new customers, right? So if you're not communicating with the audience you want to communicate through the channels, mediums, platforms that they are most familiar with and that they prefer, you risk there's a risk that you're going to lose them, or you're going to lose their interest, or you're not going to be communicating with them at all, right? A second kind of thing why it matters is if you're not memorable, you'll be forgotten, right? Of course. A good brand will help your audience remember you when they think of the industry, or if you're new, it'll help establish you if you're a newcomer. And again, using these proper avenues and having a brand that can kind of either speak to the people it wants to speak to on a particular platform really, really well, or is really good at kind of spreading out the brand across multiple platforms in a consistent way, that's going to make it memorable because people are going to see your content on different platforms and go like, oh, I remember these people, right? They did this thing. So just kind of, being memorable is obviously an extremely important thing. And then you kind of need some presence outside of just existing. So you need to have some sort of presentation that details your value, right? If you're just a store on the side of the road, or an office space, it's really hard for people to understand what you are, who you are, what you're doing, that kind of thing. So whether you're doing a traditional branding asset or digital ones, you need to be seen. And being seen requires a sort of modern, strategic, agile, versatile brand development. I think that's it for me, but we will be taking any questions that folks might have had in the chat. So if you have questions right now, feel free to shoot them out in the chat, or if Katie, if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, so get your questions in if you have any questions. And I did want to mention, so after this, you're going to get an email with an invite to a roundtable. And if you haven't participated in any of our roundtables before, basically it's an open discussion. It's over Zoom, and you can turn your cameras on and you can actually talk to us. That's always nice to see people's faces. But yeah, basically it's just a casual conversation, and you can bring any questions that you have specific to your business, and we can kind of get into the details a little bit more and offer any advice or insights that we have, and we can kind of talk through it a little more. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. And if you are interested in asking any in-depth questions, definitely join us for that. So that is going to be March 10th. So keep an eye out for that. And then I think we had a slide with our contact info at the end. Please hold.
1 moment, please. Yeah, so there's Katie's email. Yep. Katie's source at Overit, and Dinsmore at Overit.com. So yeah, come to the roundtable.
If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And otherwise, we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks, folks.
Thank you.